Thank you so much for coming this evening and welcome to our second Poet-in-Residence reading series of the semester. I'm happy you took the time out to hear some amazing work by tonight's reader, Roxane Gay. By the time I discovered Roxane Gay's work, she was already a phenomenon. I had encountered the online magazine she edits and writes for, the Rumpus, in one of those fortuitous internet accidents where you kind of don't know how you clicked your way to where you wound up, but you were really happy you got there because it wound up being somewhere wonderful. And the Rumpus features writing by some amazing minds. Cheryl Strait, Dear Sugar, did a lot of writing for them. And it was here that I stumbled upon the particularly thrilling writing of Roxane Gay, who is also the nonfiction editor. In all of her essays, which cover topics as wide-ranging as the Hunger Games and the wildly, if lamentably popular 50 Shades of Grey, to presidential elections, Trayvon Martin's murder, Roxane Gay does what I believe all good writing should aim to do, which is offer thoughtful, intelligent, nuanced insights into the singular experiences of the writer, but through them to illuminate the multiple dimensions of our shared human experience. Roxane is also the author of a riveting collection of short stories, Ayiti, which takes its readers on a journey through its namesake, the Caribbean island of Haiti. The stories wrestle with love and loss, struggle and redemption, the place of self in the community and family and whatever grand scheme of things you happen to envision. And of course, because it is story, the language or silence with which we engage those abstract and critical questions. And Ayiti is on sale in the back. Yes? All right. So, and she'll be reading from that tonight as well. Her essays and short stories have been widely published in journals and anthologies, including Best American Short Stories of 2012, and I believe a couple other years as well. News Stories from the Midwest, 2011-2012, Best Sex Writing, Noon, Salon, Indiana Review, Ninth Letter. You get the point. She's a co-editor of Pink Magazine, an online journal, and she teaches writing at Eastern Illinois University. She's, in a word, quite fabulous, and we're so pleased to welcome her here to the University of Dubuque. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you all for coming on a Thursday night. I know that the weekend starts tonight, so after this we can really go and have a drink. So I thought I would start by reading a zombie story because, you know, the zombies are awesome. Actually, I hate zombies, but I was talking to my mom, who's a devout Catholic, and she doesn't really believe in imaginary things at all. And she was like, oh yes, zombies are real. And I was like, what? I thought maybe senility was setting in early, and turned out she wasn't senile. There's this thing that happens whenever my mom is trying to explain something that happens in Haiti, but that she doesn't approve of. She calls it in the countryside. And so she said that in the countryside, they make zombies, which is to put people in a deeply impressionable state and make them work land. So it's a form of slavery that's drug-induced. And so I thought, oh my God, my mom is so weird. And then I went online and I did a little research, and it turned out she knew what she was talking about, which I should have learned 30 years ago. And so I wrote a story based on what I had learned and what she told me about these zombies. So first I thought I would give you a primer on things Americans do not know about zombies. First of all, they're not dead. They are near death. There's a difference. They are not imaginary. They do not eat human flesh. They cannot eat salt. And they do not walk around with their arms and legs locked stiffly. However, they can be saved. Here's how you pronounce zombie. It's zombie. You have to seal it in the roof of your mouth and let it vibrate and then say it really fast. The M is sort of silent. And now, in case you're wondering, here's how you make a zombie. You need a good reason, a really good reason. I cannot stress that enough. You also need a puffer fish and a small sample of blood and hair from your chosen candidate. And then, here you go. You have to kill the puffer fish. Don't be squeamish. Just extract the poison. Find a way. Allow the poison to dry, and then grind it with the blood and hair you've chosen to create your powder. A good chemist can help. And then blow the powder into your candidate's face and wait. So now I'll tell you a love story. Micheline Bernard always loved Lionel Desormeaux. Their parents were friends, though that bonhomie had not quite carried on to the children. Micheline and Lionel went to primary and secondary school together, had known each other all their lives. When Lionel looked upon Micheline, he was always overcome with the vague feeling he had seen her somewhere before, while she was overcome with the precise knowledge that he was the man of her dreams. In truth, everyone loved Lionel. He was tall and brown, with high cheekbones and full lips. His body was perfectly muscled, and after a long day of swimming in the ocean, he would emerge from the salty water glistening. Micheline would sit in a cabana invisible. She would lick her lips and stare. She would think, "Look at me, Lionel," but he never did. When Lionel walked, there was an air about him. He moved slowly but with deliberate steps, and sometimes when he walked, people swore they could hear the bass of a deep drum. His mother, who loved her only boy more than any other, always told him, "Lionel, you are the son of Louverture," and he believed her. He believed everything his mother told him. Lionel always told his friends, "My father freed our people. I am his greatest son." In Port-au-Prince, there were too many women. Micheline knew competition for Lionel's attention was fierce. She was attractive, petite. She wore her thick hair in a sensible bun. On weekends, she would let that hair down, and when she walked by, men would shout, "Quelle belle paire de jambes," what beautiful legs, and Micheline would savor the thrilling taste of their attention. Most Friday nights, Micheline and her friends would gather at Oasis, a popular nightclub on the edge of the Bel Air slum. She drank fruity drinks and smoked French cigarettes and wore skirts revealing just the right amount of leg. Lionel was always surrounded by a mob of adoring women. He let them buy him rum and cokes and always sat at the center of the room wearing his pressed linen slacks and dark t-shirts that showed off his perfect, chiseled arms. At the end of the night, he would select one woman to take home, bed her thoroughly, and wish her well the following morning. The stone path to his front door was lined with the tears and the soiled panties of the women he had sexed and then scorned. On her birthday, Micheline decided that she was going to be the woman that Lionel took home. She wore a bright sundress, strapless. She dabbed perfume everywhere she wanted to feel Lionel's lips. She wore high heels so high her brother had to help her into the nightclub. When Lionel arrived to hold court, Micheline made sure she was closest. She smiled widely and angled her shoulders just so and leaned in so he could see everything he wanted to see within her ample cleavage. At the end of the night, Lionel nodded in her direction. He said, "Tonight, you will know the affections of Louverture's greatest son." In Lionel's bed, Micheline fell deeper in love than she thought possible. Lionel knelt between her thighs, gently massaging her knees. He smiled luminously, casting a bright shaft of light across her body. Micheline reached for Lionel, her hands thrumming as she felt his skin. When he was inside her, she thought her heart might stop, so it seized so painfully. He whispered in her ear, his breath so hot it blistered her. He said, "Everything on this island is mine. You are mine." Micheline said, "I am your victory." He said, "Tonight you are." As they made love, Micheline heard the bass of a deep drum. The following morning, Lionel walked Micheline home. He kissed her chastely on the cheek. As he pulled away, Micheline grabbed his hand, pressing a knuckle with her thumb. She said, "I will come to you tonight." Lionel placed one finger over her lips and shook his head. Micheline was unable to rise from her bed for a very long time. She could only remember Lionel's touch, his words, how the inside of her body had molded itself to him. Her parents sent for a doctor, then a priest, and finally a mambo, which they were hesitant to do because they were a good Catholic family. But the sight of their youngest daughter in bed, perfectly still, not eating, not speaking, it was too much to bear. The mambo sat on the edge of the bed and clucked. She held Micheline's limp wrist. She said, "Love," and Micheline nodded. The mambo shooed the girl's parents out of the room and they left, overjoyed that the child had finally moved. The mambo leaned down, got so close Micheline could feel the old woman's dry lips against her ear. When the mambo left, Micheline bathed, dabbed herself everywhere she wanted to feel Lionel's lips. She went to Oasis and found Lionel in the center of the room holding a pale young thing in his lap. Micheline pushed the girl out of Lionel's lap and took her rightful place. She said, "Just one more night," and Lionel remembered her moans and the strength of her thighs and how she looked at him like the conquering hero he knew himself to be. They made love that night, and Micheline was possessed. She dug her fingernails into his back until he bled. She locked her ankles in the small of his back and sank her teeth into his strong shoulder. There were no sweet words between them. Micheline walked herself home before she woke. She went to the kitchen and filled a mortar and pestle with blood from beneath her fingernails and between her teeth. She added a few strands of Lionel's hair and a powder the Mambo had given her. She ground these things together and put the powder into a silk sachet. She ran back to Lionel's where he was still sleeping, opened her sachet and paused. She traced the edge of his face, kissed his forehead, then blew her precious powder into his face. Lionel coughed in his sleep, then stilled. Micheline undressed and stretched herself alongside him, her arm beneath his. As his body grew cooler, she kissed the back of his neck. They slept entwined for 3 days. Lionel's skin grew clammy and gray. His eyes hollowed. He began to smell like soil and salt wind. When Micheline woke, she whispered, "Turn and look at me." Lionel slowly turned and stared at Micheline, his eyes wide open, unblinking. She gasped at his appearance, how his body had changed. She said, "Touch me." And Lionel reached for her with a heavy hand, pawing at her until she said, "Touch me gently." She said, "Sit up." Lionel slowly sat up, listening from side to side, until Micheline steadied him. She kissed Lionel's thinned lips, his fingertips. His cold body filled her with a sadness she could hardly bear. She said, "Smile," and his lips stretched tightly into something that resembled what she knew of a smile. Micheline thought about the second sachet, the one hidden between her pillows and the sheets of a Bible, the sachet with a powder containing the power to make Lionel the man he once was, tall, vibrant, the greatest son of Louverture, a man who filled the air with the bass of a deep drum when he walked. She made herself forget about that power. Instead, she would always remember that man. She pressed her hand against the sharpness of Lionel's cheekbone and she said, "Love me." So, if you ever want to hook that up for yourself, feel free. I swear by that recipe. That's how I got a man. So I write both fiction and nonfiction because why not? They're both awesome. And a lot of my stories are grounded in some kind of truth. My parents are Haitian. I was born here in the United States, Omaha, Nebraska. Of course. I mean, where else would I be from? And growing up, my parents always would talk about Haiti, and they would talk about it with a real fondness, and we would go there in the summer and come back to the States for the school year. And so Haiti took on this really sort of mythic proportion in my mind as I started to try and understand the country that they loved so much, but they left. And I kept trying to understand why they left and why they kept dragging us back. Because we were like ingrates and we hated it. It was terrible. But it was also awesome. And so a lot of my fiction, or my early fiction, was about Haiti and trying to understand what it meant to be Haitian, what it means to leave the country, and what it means to come back. And I also like to take a lot of pieces of Haitian history and incorporate them into my story. So I thought I would read you a story called In the Manner of Water or Light, which talks about the massacre that happened in Haiti when General Rafael Trujillo was trying to get the Haitians out of the country. And I've been really fascinated by that story, and so I decided to write something of a myth that rose out of those events. And so this is called In the Manner of Water or Light. My mother was conceived in what would ever after be known as the Massacre River. The sharp smell of blood has followed her since. When she first moved to the United States, she read the dictionary from front to back. Her vocabulary quickly became extensive. Her favorite word is suffuse, to spread over or through in the manner of water or light. When she tries to explain how she is haunted by the smell of blood, she says that her senses are suffused with it. My grandmother knew my grandfather for less than a day. Everything I know about my family's history I know in fragments. We are the keepers of secrets. We are secrets ourselves. We try to protect each other from the geography of so much sorrow. I don't know that we succeed. As a young woman, my grandmother worked on a sugarcane plantation in Dajabon, the first town across the border Haiti shares with the Dominican Republic. She lived in a shanty with 5 other women, all strangers, and slept on a straw mat beneath which she kept her rosary, a locket holding a picture of her parents, and a picture of Clark Gable. She spoke little Spanish, so she kept to herself. Her days were long, and beneath the bright sun, her skin burned ebony and her hair bleached white. When she walked back to her quarters at the end of each day, she heard the way people stared and whispered. They steered clear. They were terrified by the absence of light around and within her. They thought she was a demon. They called her La Demonia Negra. After saying her prayers, after dreaming of Port-au-Prince and lazy afternoons at the beach and the movie house where she watched Mutiny on the Bounty and It Happened One Night and The Call of the Wild, after dreaming of the warmth of Clark Gable's embrace, My grandmother would tear her old dresses into long strips so she could better bind the cuts and scratches she earned from a long day in the cane fields. She would sleep a dreamless sleep, gathering the courage she would need to wake up the next morning. In a different time, she had been loved by two parents, had lived a good life, but then they died and she was left with nothing. And like many Haitians, she crossed over into the Dominican Republic in the hope that there her luck would change. My grandfather worked at the same plantation. He was a hard worker. He was a tall, strong man. My grandmother, late at night, when she cannot sleep, will sit with a glass of rum and coke and talk about how her hands remember the thick rope of muscle in his shoulders and thighs. His name was Jacques Bertrand. He wanted to be in the movies. He had a bright white smile that would have made him a star. My grandmother is also haunted by smells. She cannot stand the smell of anything sweet. If she smells sweetness in the air, she purses her lips and sucks on her teeth, shaking her head. Today, when we drive to our family's beach property in Maury, she closes her eyes. She can neither stand the sight of the cane fields nor the withered men and women hacking away at the stubborn stalks of cane with dull machetes. When she sees the cane fields, a sharp pain radiates across her shoulders and down her back. Her body cannot forget the labors it has known. Now, the Massacre River is shallow enough to cross by foot, but in October 1937, the waters of the Dajabon River ran strong and deep. The unrest had been going on for days. Dominican soldiers determined to rid their country of the Haitian scourge. They went from plantation to plantation in a murderous rage. My grandmother did the only thing she could, burning through a long day in the cane fields, marking the time by the rise and fall of her machete blade. She prayed the trouble would pass her by. It was General Rafael Trujillo who ordered all the Haitians out of his country, who had the soldiers interrogate anyone whose skin was too dark, who looked like they belonged on the other side. It was the general who took a page from the Book of Judges to exact his genocide and bring German industry to his island. Soldiers came to the plantation where my grandmother worked. They had guns. They were cruel and spoke in loud, angry voices, took liberties. One of the women with whom my grandmother shared her shanty betrayed my grandmother's hiding place. We never speak of what happened after that. The ugly details are trapped between the fragments of our family history. We are secrets ourselves. My grandmother ended up in the river. She found a shallow place. She tried to hold her breath while she hid from the marauding soldiers on both sides of the muddy shores. There was a moment when she laid on her back and submerged herself until her entire body was covered by water, until her pores were suffused with it. She didn't come up for air until the ringing in her ears became unbearable. The moon was high and the night was cold. She smelled blood in the water. She wore only a thin dress plastered to her skin. Her feet were bare. When a bloated corpse floated by her, then an arm, a leg, something she couldn't recognize, she covered her mouth. She screamed into her own skin instead of the emptiness around her. Jacques Bertrand, who worked hard and wanted to be in the movies, found his way to the river that ran strong and deep. He moved himself through the water until he found my grandmother. He tapped her on the shoulder, and instead of turning away, she turned into him, opened that part of herself not yet numb with terror. She found comfort in the fear mirrored in his eyes. His chest was bare, and she pressed her damp cheek against his breastbone. She slowed her breathing to match his. She listened to the beat of his heart. It echoed beneath the bones of his ribcage. An angel, she told me. I thought he was an angel who had come to deliver me from that dark and hopeless place. My grandparents bound their bodies together as their skin gathered in tiny folds, as their bodies shook violently from the cold. Jacques Bertrand, who worked hard, who wanted to be in the movies, wrapped his arms around my grandmother. In a stuttered whisper, he told her the story of his life. I want to be remembered, he said. She cupped his face and traced his strong chin with her thumbs and brushed her lips across his. She followed the bridges of scars of tissue across his back with her fingertips. She said, "You will be remembered." She told him the story of her own life. She asked him to remember her, too. My grandmother still hears the dying screams from that night. She remembers the dull, wet sound of machetes through flesh and bone. The only thing that muted those horrors was a man she knew but did not know, who wore bridges of scar across his back. I do not know the intimate details, but my mother was conceived. In the morning, surrounded by the smell and silence of death, my grandparents crawled out of the river that had overnight become a watery coffin holding 25,000 bodies. The Massacre River had earned its name. The two of them, soaking wet, their bodies stiff and on the verge of fever, crawled into Wanamette. They were home. They were far from home. My grandmother laced her fingers with my grandfather's, and they sought refuge in an abandoned church. They fell to their knees and prayed, and then their prayers became something else, something like solace. When night fell again, the Dominican soldiers crossed into Wanameth, into a place they did not belong. My grandfather was killed. He saved my grandmother's life by confronting 3 soldiers and creating a window through which my grandmother could escape. Jacques Bertrand died wanting to be remembered, so my grandmother stayed in that place of such sorrow, took a job cooking and cleaning for the headmaster of a primary school. At night, she slept in an empty classroom. She gave birth to my mother and later married the headmaster who raised my mother as his own. At night, my grandmother took my mother to the river and told her the story of how she came to be. My grandmother knelt on the river bank, her bones sinking in the mud as she brought handfuls of water to her mouth. She drank the memories in that water. When my mother turned 12, she, my grandmother, and the headmaster moved to Port-au-Prince. The school had closed and the headmaster took a new appointment in the capital. At first, my grandmother refused to leave her memories, but the headmaster put his foot down. She was his wife. She would follow. My mother recalls how her mother wailed, her voice pitched sharp and thin, cutting everything around her. In the front yard of their modest home, a large coconut tree fell, its wide trunk split neatly in half. The fallen fruit rotted instantly. My grandmother went to the Massacre River, her long white hair gathered around her face. She took river mud into her hands, eating it, enduring the thick, bitter taste. When my mother and the headmaster found her, my grandmother was lying in a shallow place, shivering beneath a high moon, her face caked with dry mud. In the capital, my grandmother was a different woman, quieted. The headmaster consulted Catholic missionaries, Hungans and Mambos, in case she had been possessed by a spirit and needed healing. Finally, he resigned himself to living with her ghosts. He loved her as best a man whose wife loves another man can. He focused on my mother's education and waited. Sometimes the headmaster asked my mother if she was happy, and she said, "My mother does love you." It wasn't until the day my mother left Port-au-Prince that my grandmother became herself again. I've been told that the headmaster and my grandmother stood on the tarmac, white with heat, the air billowing around them in visible waves. My mother kissed her mother twice on each cheek. She kissed the headmaster. She turned and headed for the staircase to board the plane, a heavy wind blowing her skin wildly. My grandmother didn't run after her only child, but she did say, "Little heart." My mother stopped, but she did not turn around. My mother is a small and nervous woman. Her life began, she says, the day she got off the Pan Am flight from Port-au-Prince. In New York City, she sat at the back of a yellow taxicab driven by a man who spoke a language she did not understand. She stared out of the dirty window and up at the tall steel buildings. She was 21. My mother found an apartment in the Bronx. She took a job as a seamstress for Perry Ellis, making clothes she loved but could not afford. She learned to speak English by reading the dictionary and watching American television. Once a month, she wrote her mother, and the only father she had ever known, a long letter telling them about America, begging them to join her. My grandmother always wrote back but refused to leave Haiti. She would not leave the ghost of a man who could not be forgotten. My mother went to the doctor and trying to find someone who would free her from the sharp smell of blood that has always suffused her senses. Each doctor assured my mother that it was all in her head. She took the subway to Chinatown and tried acupuncture. The acupuncturist carefully inserted needles into the webs of her thumbs and along her body's meridians. As he placed each needle, he shook his head. He said, "There are some things no medicine can fix." When I asked my mother how she met my father, she said, "I wasn't going to marry a Haitian man." She rarely answers the questions she is asked. My father is an ear, nose, and throat specialist. He is the last doctor my mother consulted. When she told him she could only smell blood, he believed her. He tried to help her, and when he couldn't, he asked her to join him for dinner. Eventually, he asked her for his hand in marriage. She did not say yes. She told my father she would never return to Haiti, that he would have to accept that her life began a year earlier. She was a seamstress whose senses were suffused with the smell of blood, who didn't know her father and couldn't understand her mother. They were married in a Manhattan synagogue 9 months after they met. My parents remained childless for many years, but never discussed the matter. If my mother was asked when she would start a family, she would say, "I am very much in love with my husband." When she learned she was pregnant with me at the age of 40, it was a hot July afternoon in New York, 1978. She ran out onto the street and threw her hands in the air, stared into the incandescent sun. She cried as the light spread over her. A joyful sound vibrated from her throat, through her mouth, and into the city around her. She went to my father's office and told him the news. He cried too. When I was born, I was crying lustily, We are a family unafraid of our tears. My mother has never been able to accept that she will never know her father. She worries her mother has woven the story of her conception into an elaborate fable to hide a darker truth. My mother has an imagination. She knows too much about what angry, wild soldiers will do to frightened and fleeing young women. My mother looks in the mirror and cannot recognize herself. She only sees the face of a man she can never know. When I was a little girl and we sat together at the dinner table, my mother often stared into the distance, grinding her teeth. My father would take her hand and say, "Jacqueline, please, stop worrying." She never did. She was the keeper of her mother's secrets. She was a secret herself. Every summer, once I turned 5, my parents took me to JFK and sent me to my grandmother's for 3 months. I was dispatched to do the work of dutiful daughter in my mother's absence. My grandmother and the man I know as my grandfather, the headmaster who took in a scared young woman whose skin had burned ebony, whose hair had bleached white, who bore a child with no father, they were kind to me. I brought them pictures of my parents and money my mother carefully stuffed in my shoes. I brought cooking oil and pantyhose, a VCR and videotapes, gossip magazines, cornflakes. I knew never to bring anything sweet. My grandmother kept her promise to Jacques Bertrand. Each time she saw me, she offered new fragments of their story, or if my mother's fears are correct, her story. I looked like him. He had his eyes and his chin. Like my parents, my grandmother and the headmaster doted on me. When I returned to the States at the end of each August, I would try to ask my mother questions to better piece things together, but she would only shut herself in her room, rub perfume across her upper lip, lie on her back, her eyes covered with a cool washcloth. When I was 13, the headmaster drove my grandmother and I to their beach property for the afternoon. Just before leaving New York for the summer, I celebrated my bar mitzvah. The 3 of us sang along to compas, and the adults listened to me chattering from the back seat. It was a good day. I longed for my mother to know there was so much joy to be found in the country of her birth. As we pulled into a gas station, beggars suddenly swarmed our car, a throbbing mass of dark, shiny faces and limbs, needing more than we could possibly give. There was a man with 1 leg and 1 wooden crutch. His face was disfigured by a bulging tumor beneath his left eye. He planted his hands against the glass of the window, leering at me, the skin over the tumor rippling with anger. It was the first time I understood that the land of my mother's birth was a place run through with pain. Each time I returned to New York, in the comforts of home, I brought pictures and long letters and special spices, these affections, mother by proxy. My mother always took me for lunch alone at the Russian tea room the day following my return. She had me recount my trip in exhaustive detail, inhaling from a perfume-scented handkerchief every few minutes, carefully probing so as to get the clearest sense of how her mother was doing. Once in a while, I forgot myself and asked my mother why she didn't just go to Haiti and find out for herself. In those moments, she gave me a stern look. She said, "It is not easy to be a good daughter." When I turned 16, I went to summer camp in western Massachusetts because I was young and silly and I wanted to do normal things. Haiti was too much work. I was tired of the heat and the smells and the inescapable poverty, how sweaty my limbs were and how they got caught in mosquito netting, how I had to go to the well for water when the cistern wasn't working. I was sick of the loud hum of generators and tiny lizards clinging to window screens and the way everyone stared at me and called me La Mulatte. Summer camp was a largely disappointing experience. I was a city girl and the Berkshires were far too rural for me. I wasn't any kind of Jewish the other girls could understand. I spent the summer sitting on the lakeshore reading, lamenting that I could have been at a real beach in the Caribbean with people who loved me and looked like me. It would be 10 years before I returned. The next summer, my father took me to Tel Aviv. He showed me the apartment where he grew up in Ramat Aviv. He showed me his parents' graves and told me how much they would have loved me. I saw all kinds of people who did indeed look like me, who didn't laugh at my stuttered Hebrew. We spent a week on kibbutz, my father in his linen shirt and shorts, tanned, laughing, home. I felt a real sadness from my mother who couldn't take such joy in the land of her birth. We went to the beach. We went to Jaffa and looked toward the sea and Andromeda's rock. We cried at the Wailing Wall. I understood that Haiti was not the only place in the world run through with pain. The year after I graduated from law school, the headmaster died. I called my grandmother to ask how she was doing. She said, "I have been a good wife." She was ready to return to Jacques Bertrand. I told my mother we had to go see her mother. She was lying on her bed, rubbing perfume across her upper lip. She had not taken news of the headmaster's death well. He was the only father she ever knew. She turned to me and said, "This is my home where I am needed." And I said, "You are needed elsewhere." And she waved a hand limply, conceding the point. My father prescribed my mother some Valium, and the three of us flew to Port-au-Prince. By the time we landed, my mother was sufficiently sedated. As we disembarked and walked into the terminal, she dreamily asked, "Are we there?" My grandmother and her driver were waiting for us. I inhaled sharply as I saw her for the first time in a decade. She was impossibly small, a frail figure, her dark flesh much looser now, her features hollowed, her white hair swept atop her head in a loose bun. She and my mother stood inches apart and stared at each other. My grandmother took her daughter's face in her hands and nodded. That night, in our hotel, I heard my mother whisper to my father that she could barely breathe but for the smell of blood. After a few days in the capital, helping my grandmother settle her affairs and visiting the headmaster's grave, she was ready to return to Jacques Bertrand. Despite our demand that she stay in the capital or return to the States with us, my grandmother was resolute. We drove across the country to Wanameth on the only passable road. It took hours, and by the time we arrived, we were all tired, sweaty, sore, and irritable. Wanameth was not the city it had once been. It was a sad and hopeless place, crumbling buildings everywhere, paint peeling from billboards, the streets crowded with people, each person wanting and needing more than the next. Most of the roads had gone to mud from recent flooding. The air was stifling and pressed down on us uncomfortably. As we stood in the courtyard in front of the small concrete house my grandmother had purchased, men hanging from a passing tap-tap leered at us. My father stood in front of me, glaring. My mother rubbed her forehead and asked my father for another Valium. My mother and her mother kept to themselves for the first few days, huddled together, trying to make up for nearly 30 years of separation. There was no room for my father and I and what they needed from one another. On the second night, I went to a local bar where everyone stared as I took a seat at the bar. I drank watery rums and coke until my face and my boredom were numbed. I danced to Usher with a man named Innocent. When I snuck back into my grandmother's house, I found her sitting in the dark. She nodded to me but said nothing. On the third night, the moon was high and bright, casting its pale light over and through everything. I lay beneath mosquito netting in a tank top and boxers, an arm over my head, one across my stomach, my body feeling open and loose. I listened to the sounds of everyone else sleeping. I tried to understand the what and why of where we were. Just as I was on the verge of drifting asleep, I heard a scratching at the door and sat up, pulling the sheets around me. My grandmother appeared in the doorway. She curled her bent fingers, beckoned. Slowly, I stretched myself out of bed, pulling on a pair of jeans and flip-flops. I found my grandmother by the front door. My mother was standing next to her, fidgeting, shifting from one foot to the other, clutching at her perfume-scented handkerchief. "What's wrong?" I asked. My grandmother smiled in the darkness. "Come with us," she said. We walked nearly a mile to the banks of the Massacre River, my grandmother pressing her hand against the small of my mother's back. In the distance, we could see soldiers keeping watch at the checkpoint, their cigarettes punctuating the darkness. I heard hundreds of frightened people who looked like me splashing through the water, searching for safety, and then silence. My grandmother climbed down damp, steep riverbank, and my mother warned her mother to be careful. She waved for us to join her. I slipped out of my sandals, took my mother's hand, and helped her into the river. We stood in a shallow place. I curled my toes in the silt of the riverbed and shivered. I had pictured the river as a wide, yawning, and bloody beast, but where we stood, the river flowed weakly. The waters did not run deep. It was just a border between two geographies of grief. My grandmother pointed. The hem of her dressing gown floated around her. "Here," she said softly. My mother's shoulders shook, but she made no sound. She gripped my arm. "I cannot breathe," she said. Then she dropped to her knees, curled into herself. She said, "I must know the truth." I knelt behind her. I held her and tried to understand her. I said, "You can breathe." My grandmother said, "You know the only truth that matters." Again, I heard hundreds of frightened people splashing through the water, keening, reaching for something that could never be reached. The ground beneath us trembled from the heavy footsteps of roving soldiers. I smelled their sweat and their confused, aimless anger. We knelt there for a long while. My grandmother stood, whispering the story of how she came to know and remember Jacques Bertrand until her words dried on her lips. I stroked my mother's hair gently, waited for her breathing to slow, her back rising into my chest with a melancholy cadence. We mourned until morning. The sun rose high. Bright beams of light spread over and through us. The sun burned so hot it dried the river itself, turned the water into light. We were left kneeling in a bed of sand and bones. I started crying, and I could not stop. I cried to wash us all clean. Thanks. I thought I would read some strict, straight-up nonfiction. People call me a feminist, and they act like that's a bad thing. Like, you're an angry feminist, but I'm not angry at all. I'm very happy, and I am a feminist. But anger and feminism are not synonymous. Anyway, this summer I was teaching composition for money, and one of my students said, it was a girl, her name was Savannah, that's her name, it is, and she said, feminism is bullshit. And I was just like, oh my God. I didn't even know, like, it was a great teaching moment for me because I wanted to cuss her out. And I was like, oh, okay, be calm, she's 19. And I tried to explain to her that feminism is not bullshit and that feminism allows her to say things like that and have her own opinions. And so I wrote this essay called Bad Feminist because I'm a terrible feminist, I really am. I don't believe in taking trash out. I don't know anything about cars, and I never will. There are things that I call man work, and so I'm not a good feminist. But then I kept thinking about Savannah, and she had a real problem with some of the women in class, and she kept talking about how it's just impossible to be friends with women. And you hear this all the time, like, oh, women are the worst, and I only have guy friends. And so I decided to write this essay called How to Be Friends with Another Woman, and it was published on a website called Jezebel, which is a pop culture feminist blog. And so these are just some rules on how to be friends with another woman. And if you're a guy, well, you can just tell your girlfriends later. These are good tips. So the first rule is abandon the cultural myth that all female friendships must be toxic, bitchy, or competitive. This myth is like heels and purses, pretty but designed to slow women down. This is not to say that women aren't bitches or toxic or competitive sometimes, but rather to say that these are not defining characteristics of female friendships, especially as you get older. There's a lot of ink that's given over to mythologizing female friendships as curious, fragile relationships that are always intensely fraught. Stop reading writing that encourages this mythology. If you find that you are feeling competitive, toxic, or bitchy toward the women who are supposed to be your closest friends, look at why and figure out how to fix it, or find someone who can help you fix it. If you are the kind of woman who says, I'm mostly friends with guys, and act like you're proud of that, like that makes you closer to being a man or something and less of a woman, as if a woman is a bad thing, see item 3. It's okay if most of your friends are guys, but if you champion this as a commentary on the nature of female friendships, well, soul search a little. If you feel like it's hard to be friends with women, maybe consider that women aren't the problem. Maybe it's just you. I used to be this kind of woman. I'm sorry. Sometimes your friends will date people you cannot stand. You can either be honest about your feelings or you can lie. There are good reasons for both. Sometimes you will be dating the person your friends cannot stand. If your man or a woman is a scrub, just own it so you and your friends can talk about more interesting things. My go-to explanation is, I am dating an asshole because I'm lazy. You are welcome to borrow it. Want nothing but the best for your friends, because when your friends are happy and successful, it's probably going to be easier for you to be happy. If you're having a rough go of it and a friend is having the best year ever and you need to think some dark thoughts about that, do it alone with your therapist or in your diary so that when you actually see your friend, you can avoid the myth discussed in item 1. If you and your friends are in the same field and you can collaborate or help each other, do this without shame. It's not your fault your friends are awesome. Men invented nepotism and practically live by it. It's okay for women to do it too. Don't tear other women down, because even if they're not your friends, they are other women, and while this is just important, this is not to say you cannot criticize other women, but understand the difference between criticizing constructively and tearing down cruelly. Everybody gossips, so if you are going to gossip about your friends, at least make it fun and interesting. As a corollary, never say, I never lie or I never gossip, because you are lying. Love your friends' kids, even if you don't want or like children. Just do it. Tell your friends the hard truths they need to hear. They might get pissed about it, but it's probably for their own good. The other day, my best friend told me to get it together about my love life and demanded an action plan, and while it was irritating, but it was also useful. Don't be totally rude about truth-telling, and consider how much truth is actually needed to get the job done. Finesse goes a long way. These conversations are more fun when preceded by an emphatic, girl. Surround yourself with women you can get sloppy drunk with, who won't draw stupid things on your face if you pass out, or will help you puke if you over-celebrate, or who will also tell you if you get sloppy drunk too much or behave badly when you are sloppy drunk. Don't flirt too much, have sex, or engage in an emotional affair with your friends' significant others. This shouldn't need to be said, but it needs to be said. That significant other is an asshole, and you don't want to be involved with an asshole that's used goods. If you want to be with an asshole, get a fresh one of your own. They are abundant. They are. I have a bunch of numbers in my phone. Just saying. Don't let your friends buy ugly outfits or accessories you don't want to look at when you hang out. This is just common sense. When something is wrong and you need to talk to your friends and they ask you how you are, don't say, fine. They know you're lying and it's irritating, and a lot of time is wasted with the back and forth of, are you sure? And yes, and really? And I am fine. Just tell your friends the truth so you can talk it out and either sulk companionably or move on to other topics. If 4 people are dining, split the check evenly 4 ways. We're adults now. We don't need to add up what each person had anymore. If you're high rolling, just treat everyone and rotate who treats. But if you're still broke, do what you have to do. If a friend sends a crazy email needing reassurance about love, life, family, or work, respond accordingly in a timely manner, even if it's just to say, girl, I hear you. If a friend sends you like 30 crazy emails needing reassurance about the same shit, be patient, because one day that's going to be you tearing up the email with your drama. My mother's favorite saying is, qui se ressemble s'assemble. Whenever she didn't approve of who I was spending time with, she would say this ominously. It means essentially you are who you surround yourself with. So thank you for coming. I can take questions if you have questions. Or I can just set you free.
Been back here lately?
Back here? I've never been here before. This is.
Have you been back to Haiti lately?
No, I haven't been in a while because there's been a rash of kidnappings lately. And my aunt was kidnapped last year, and so my dad was worried about my mother and I. So my dad and my brother work there, but my mother and I haven't gone back in a while.
Why are they kidnapping people?
For money.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Who gives them money?
The families of the people who are kidnapped.
Ransom?
It's ransom, yeah. It's a nice cottage industry, yes.
What started you to be an active feminist?
Oh, my mother, I guess. My mother, even though I don't think she would call herself a feminist, my mother is just a badass, and she was a stay-at-home mom, and she wouldn't teach me how to cook or clean growing up because she didn't want me to cook or clean after a man. And so she started to instill in me that I should probably hire a maid, but which I do. But she just instilled in me to be independent, and I have 2 brothers, and she treated us the same and expected the same things of us, and she just always told me that, you know, you're equal to a man. And so I guess it started with her, and then I just like went off running with it a lot. Now my dad is like, oh, he doesn't even get it. It's awesome. Any other questions? Yes.
How come you hate zombies?
Oh, they're so boring, like enough. I don't even get it. Like, I don't even understand like what a zombie is. I don't understand why they eat human flesh. I don't understand the walk. I don't understand their ravenous appetites. I don't understand why they're so indestructible. I don't understand like zombie apocalypses and how they keep happening in movie after movie, and like no one's solved this problem yet. It's just like the common cold now, and we still haven't cured that either. So it's just irritating. There aren't enough good zombie stories, really.
We have a zombie class. We have a zombie expert right in front. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. I'm in his class.
Nice. Zombies are really interesting. I actually have a colleague who's teaching about post 9/11 fiction and looking at some of the ways in which our post 9/11 fears are being manifested, and she looks to zombies as one of the reasons, and so she's doing a lot of stuff with zombie stuff. And I think it's interesting. You can look at The Walking Dead, sort of the Resident Evil series, 28 days later, 28 weeks later? Yes. And so I think there's some interesting stuff to be had there, but I was just getting so tired of it. It was because of the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, yes. That just made me lose it, because Jane Austen, represent, she's amazing. And, this whole, let's remix a 17th century literature, 18th century literature, 19th century literature, fine, whatever. But it drove me crazy. That's what set me off. So it's not really zombies, but it's just like that sort of weird cultural appropriation of Jane Austen. Ugh.
Bad. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good, good. I'm glad we're like against that. Yes. Yes.
Sorry. So this is the nonfiction series, and
Mhm.
I'm the poet in residence, and so could you talk a little bit about, you write both nonfiction and fiction,
I do.
how you make that distinction, and what are some of the hallmarks you think of good nonfiction?
Good nonfiction, I think, tells a good story, even if it's nonfiction. It makes people think. I think it has to be accessible. I think a lot of times when people write nonfiction, they create this weird distance that feels very academic. And I have no problem with academic writing. I got a PhD, so obviously I can tolerate it. But I do try to put some intimacy into my nonfiction writing. Even when I'm writing about sort of deep scholarly subjects, I do try to still bring some humanity into it. And so I look for that. I look for good research. A lot of times people think, oh, I'm just going to write about my feelings. No, you also have to put research into your nonfiction writing. You do have to back it up. And so I like to blend personal narrative with well-researched nonfiction. Yeah, you've read my stuff, so yeah. Any other questions? What up? Let's hear it. Oh, I thought they may have had a question because they were like whispering back and forth. Or they're just like, oh. I see everything I teach. So.
How about writing humor? What is that?
Oh, I don't do it on purpose. I just, no, I love to make myself laugh. No, I don't like write explicit humor, but I do think that a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And if you want to get people to care and to talk about important issues, sometimes it's useful to use humor or at least some wit to frame some of the message so that it's less antagonistic. That's what I did with my essay, Bad Feminist, which is in Virginia Quarterly Review right now, and I just thought, oh, how can I talk about how women need to claim their feminism more openly? And so humor helps. Thanks for coming, all.
Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to make a pitch. Thank you so much. Our last one is December 3rd, and Professor Marianne Choquet will be reading for us. So join us same bat place, I guess, and same time, 6 o'clock right here on December 3rd. Thank you again.